You saw that in the news and pretty much everywhere. The very famous metric, the GDP, is under constant attack. And that kind of critics are far from being recent.
But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them.
Some people around here say that the GDP is old, not adapted to the 21st century, or even deeply flawed. But is that kind of criticism really fair? And what is the GDP exactly? Well, that's what we're going to see in this episode of Money Talk. Let's dive in. The GDP measures the economic output of a country. In other words, the production of a nation. It is like the net income of the country during the last year. There are several ways to picture and to show the GDP, but let us see the most intuitive one. The GDP is the sum of 5 different elements. The first component of GDP is consumption. Here we will see the amount of money that people spend buying different items, for example, food, TVs, cars, houses, etc. The second component is investment. Here we see the amount of money a company may use to build a new manufacturing plant, for example, or the amount of money that the farmer uses to buy a new tractor. Then we have government spending, that is, the amount of money that the government spends on military, for example, or by building a bridge, or by providing social security. Then, using the letter X, we have the amount of exports of the country. And finally, from all of this, you have to subtract imports, that is, the amount of foreign goods that got into the country. For very long, the GDP has been considered as a measure of welfare. And up until recently, there was a consensus that if a country had a high GDP, well, the quality of life of the population was high too. And yes, like everything, the GDP has shortcomings. It doesn't measure underground activities, such as informal work or illegal work. The GDP doesn't take volunteer or housework into account. The GDP also takes into account bad things, such as prosecutions, or police investigating a crime, or soldiers going to war. The GDP is also completely blind when it comes to negative side effects of production, such as pollution, forest destruction, or climate change. Some critics go even further, saying that this old metric made in the manufacturing age is completely obsolete and useless for the internet age and should be completely forgotten. The critics have some fair points about the GDP, but the GDP is still the best indicator out there and the best indicator of success for a country. And to show you this, we are going to debunk together 3 myths about the GDP. Myth number 1. The GDP doesn't measure welfare. That is the myth that we hear the most. They say that a GDP is not a measure of welfare because the GDP only measures economic activity, and that economic activity is not a synonym of welfare. Well, the majority of the time, economic activity is a synonym of welfare. In countries where the GDP is high, people tend to be healthier, with lower infant mortality and a higher life expectancy. Education tends to be better when the GDP is high. So yes, we can say that the GDP does measure welfare. And let's look at a very interesting example of this. There is a city called Nogales, and this city has a peculiarity. One part of the city is in the US and the other part of the city is in Mexico. Both parts of Nogales have the same geography, the same climate, and its population have the same ethnic background. The only difference is that one part of Nogales is in the high GDP country, that is the United States, and the other part is in the lower GDP country, Mexico, and we see enormous differences in lifestyle. In the Mexican part of Nogales, the average salary is only 1/3 of the average salary of the American part of Nogales. In the Mexican part of Nogales, the crime rate is much higher, health system is much worse, and people live shorter lives. So that you see, it is difficult to argue that the welfare in the American part of Nogales is higher than the welfare in the Mexican part of Nogales. Myth number 2. Most people do not benefit from GDP. This is another classic. where they say that when the GDP grows, rich get richer and poor get poorer. But this one is fairly easy to debunk. It has been shown that the higher the GDP of a country is, the lower the Gini index tends to be. The Gini index, by the way, is a measure of inequality. Inequality tends to be lower in high GDP countries for the reasons we mentioned before. In high GDP countries, the education tends to be better, which brings more opportunities, especially for the people in the lower middle class or lower class. Where do you think you have more opportunities? In a place like the UK, where people generally go to school up until they are 18 years old, or in a place like Bangladesh, where kids go to work even at 12 years old? So no, a high GDP benefits to the majority of people. Myth number 3. GDP does not equal happiness. Well, that becomes difficult because happiness is difficult to measure. But when we compare the GDP per capita and the level of self-reported life satisfaction, all the studies agree. The higher the GDP is, the more satisfied the population is. And they're not satisfied with the country or the government, they are satisfied about their own lives. It is easy to imagine that you are happier if you're in better health and your kids go to better schools and you have more opportunities. But there are some interesting exceptions. Latin American countries tend to be very happy given their relative poorness. But apart from those exceptions, the relationship is clear. The higher the GDP is, the more happy the population is. And even if we look at the most happy countries in the world, well, surprise, surprise, they are all high GDP countries. Something to think about next time you will hear somebody talk trash about GDP. I hope you liked this video, and if that is the case, a little thumbs up is always appreciated. If you want to share your opinion, do not feel shy to put it in the comment section below. And if there is a topic you want me to cover in a future video, you can send me an email to the address that is in the description, also below. I will see you very soon for the next episode of Money Talk. In the meantime, take care.